Welcome to Your College-Bound Kid,
podcast for parents and families everywhere.
Whether you have kids that plan to attend college or you have current college students, you want them in and you want them to graduate.
You want a quality education that will give you a skill set that will make you marketable for the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. I am Mark Stucker, and I'm a college coach from Metro Atlanta.
And I am Annita Madden, and I am a parent, also from Atlanta, currently in North Carolina.
And I'm David Williams, and I'm a dad from Chicago, Illinois. Today is Thursday, March 19th. This week in the news, Mark and I will be discussing an article by Emma Whitford from Inside Higher Education, Are Any Colleges Insured Against the Coronavirus Fallout? Mark and Annita will discuss how can you find merit-based scholarships from the colleges themselves. Mark and Annita will also discuss our question, which comes from Annita in New York. And Annita wants to know, will colleges look favorably at a B+ from my son's very rigorous school favorably compared to an A at another less challenging high school? Mark will be in part 2 of his interview with Edan Shahar, the founder of Test Innovators, and they will be discussing what is misunderstood about standardized testing. And finally, Mark will be doing his first college spotlight for a Virginia university as he and I will be discussing Christopher Newport University.
Friends, everywhere we go, it is Corona. And those of you who are very astute recall that at the very end of episode 111, Dave said our preview for next week would be on legacy admissions. And even back in January, when we talked about 10 ways to change admissions, Annita and I said, wait 8 weeks. We're talking about legacy admissions. But this is a case where we needed to have a breaking news. We're still going to give you the legacy admission discussion. That'll be episode 113. But today, we want to reflect our title of In the News and talk about what is in the news. So we did, Dave, you've listened to every episode. You know, we did a breaking news segment when U Chicago went test optional. We did one.
I remember that.
With the environmental. Yep. You remember when the environmental context dashboard came out? We did one on that. We did one with Rick Singer and his side door hustle. And we did one when the ACT made massive changes to go into single sessions and online and all the other changes they made. So this, I think, is our 5th or 6th audible, like a quarterback throwing an audible and changing the play up. But Corona, it's everywhere. Absolutely. Now, why don't we start by talking about what's going on with the school closings, Dave?
Well, we got a pleasant surprise for empty nesters who missed their kids going off to college. My dear daughter came back from Yale just the other day with the notice that she may not be going back to school until further notice. And that was confirmed yesterday when Yale said that all students shall remain at home until at least April 5th, and then they will reassess. And in that time, her next semester, the classes will be moved online. Most athletic functions are going to be canceled. The big Bulldog Days, which is the recruiting for all admitted students, are going to be canceled. And even summer programs are somewhat in doubt until there is more clarification on this whole coronavirus pandemic. So we were excited, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just Yale, Dave.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not just Yale because, University of California, Hofstra, Columbia, Harvard, Duke, UCLA,
Stanford.
Vanderbilt, Stanford. Yeah, it goes on and on and on. So we don't quite know where this thing is going, but it is a little ubiquitous. And I got a scare this week when, Dave and I were talking and you said to me, you treated your first Corona patient. Tell us about that, Dave. What was that like?
Actually, we don't know if it was Corona because here's the crazy thing. We have quite a few patients and we suspect that they may be Corona, but we don't know because there are no testing kits. So every time we see an elderly person with some weird respiratory systems, our suspicions are heightened. But until we get adequate testing, and I believe the testing is finally going to be rolled out in the next week or two, we are all speculating, but we don't really know if they're corona or not. So I was joking to you, I think I took care of my first corona, but I don't know, which is part of the
and I
problem.
have a question for you about that. So, like, how do doctors, healthcare workers, nurses, how do you keep yourself from freaking out that you're going to catch it because corona's around everywhere and you're, you know what I mean? You're inevitably interacting with some people and they talk about community spread. Like, is it just one of these things that you're just so used to, or are there protections you take? Or because I would think that you become incredibly susceptible to getting corona.
Well, the one thing about medical professionals is we do focus on the information and in the data. And I do think there is a lot of panic simply because people aren't focusing on what we do know and what we don't know. Now, what we do know is this is a coronavirus. It is a cold virus. Like many other viruses, they can appear somewhat out of the blue, but they do have patterns similar to other viruses. What we do know is that for the vast majority of people that get this virus, they are either asymptomatic or just mildly symptomatic, and most appear to improve in a matter of weeks with no adverse effects. But we do know that for the elderly, particularly those who have comorbid conditions, diabetes or heart disease, it could be particularly deadly. Mortality rates of 3, 4, 5%, as opposed to less than 1% from the typical influenza. But I was reading one article that said that most of the elderly that are dying, the average age is 80 years old. And what we also know about this virus is it seems to be sparing the young, which makes sense. The young with good immune systems, in many cases, there have been no mortality in that cohort. So I think a lot of the professionals have a very balanced point of view. We're used to being on the front lines of infectious disease. And I have not personally seen a coronavirus victim, at least one that has died from it, that is confirmed. So we're not about to panic yet. There are concerns.
All right. We just don't want to lose our Dave. Don't want to lose my Dave over there.
No, And I think another interesting point was the difference between prevalence and incidence. So prevalence is the amount of disease that you have in the population at any one point in time. Incidence is the new rate of spread of the disease. We don't know either the prevalence or the incidence, and that's part of the problem. And we don't know because we haven't tested for it. And my suspicion is that once we get a handle of the prevalence and the incidence, a lot of this hysteria will die down. We'll have a handle on what the actual mortality is. And in the next 3, 4, 5, or 6 months, things will look considerably better. But until we get the testing and we have an idea of what the prevalence of this disease, how widespread it is, and how much it's actually spreading, I think that it's going to lead to a lot of undue emotional panic, unfortunately.
All right. We'll transition back to admissions.
Okay.
And so I'm going to share my admissions tip for the day. And I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to read something. So a lot of you regulars know that one of the people I hold in highest regard in the profession is Rick Clark. We've had him on our podcast twice on episodes 49, 50, and 51, and also on our centennial episode 100. And Rick has been the director of admission at Georgia Tech for the last 16 years. And he's also served in many, many other schools, including Wake Forest and others before that. So Rick has an incredible admission blog. And I've actually shared his admission blog before as a recommended resource because it's really fantastic. And he sent one out yesterday that I loved. And I want to read it to you guys because a lot of admissions decisions, it's the 19th of March right now. And if you're listening, you may not be listening to this to the 21st. A lot of the more highly selective decisions come out between now and April 1st. And so this is the name of his blog. He entitled it, It Works Out. And this is what he says. He said, each year, right before we release admission decisions, I speak with our tour guides. I love talking with this group. And at their Monday night meeting, I ask them a few questions. Now, if you know Rick, he's incredibly honest, and he creates a comfort level where you can be totally transparent with him and not feel judged. So his question, a lot of people wouldn't ask this, but he says, was Georgia Tech your first choice when you applied here? And there were 71 tour guides at this meeting. And 62% of them said no, because tech overlaps a lot with Stanford, MIT. And so that's not always going to be their first choice. So 62% of the tour guides said tech was not the first choice. Then he says, how many of you are happy here now and are thankful for the way it worked out? And then he says, all but 2 responded yes, which I thought was pretty good. Plus, when I said happy here and it, they were vague. So maybe they were thinking, are they happy being here right now in this room meeting with me? Then he goes on to say, then he asks, how many of you think if you were at another college, you would have no chance for success or happiness in the short or long term? And then he says, only 1 of the 71 said that they would have no chance of happiness or success elsewhere. Now, you could call this contrarian, but I call it all in. Give that kid a TGOTY, acronym for Tour Guide of the Year award. Then Rick says, if you are a senior, whether you are waiting on an admissions decision or trying to choose from your college options in the weeks ahead, I hope you will find comfort and confidence in these responses. The take-home message is hashtag it works out. A lot of selective colleges will put decisions out in the next few days, and I don't want you to lose sight of the fact if you don't get in your first choice, it works out. Isn't that a cool admissions tip, Dave?
And that's an amazing tip. And you know, it reminds me of what you've always said, and what I've always experienced is that the whole mania of college admissions and getting into X, Y, Z college is such a transient phenomena. And that for the vast majority of kids, it becomes completely irrelevant in a matter of months. The vast majority of kids, when they get onto their college of choice, they love it. And where they went to college, even weeks after they graduate, is completely irrelevant to the rest of their life. And so we are caught up in this moment that's so artificial, it's so artifactual, and we just have to put it in life's perspective. As he says, it does work out. And as hard as it is to understand when you're in the middle of it, it really doesn't matter where you go to college. It's what you do and what you make of the place you go to that matters.
And it's a really important life lesson. You know, I follow up with my students after they're in college. And so I talked to one of my students 2 days ago. And he's having a great time, but he's really struggling in math to the point where he's not sure if he's going to pass. And I said to him, I said, you want to know something? I said, Alex, I've never, ever been asked what my math grade was in college. I haven't even been asked what my GPA was. You know, never even been asked what my grade point average was, let alone what I got in the math class. And it was so comforting to him. He said, yeah, that's what my advisor told me. But meanwhile, when you're in that echo chamber, it feels like, you know, life is going to end if I don't conquer this. So anyway, I'm going to transition because we got a lot to cover today. But that's the admissions tip. And for admission vernacular, the term is IC. Want to take a stab at that one, Dave, or not?
I see. You mean letter I, letter C?
Correct. IC.
I see. Boy, intracurricular. That's a guess.
Hey, that's not bad. So IC is actually really, really commonly used in admissions speak. This is not one of these obscure ones. And what it stands for is intellectual curiosity. Oh. Intellectual curiosity. Yeah. And it's something that in 112 episodes, I haven't nearly spent as much time talking about as especially selective colleges look for. A lot of schools have it as one of their core rating systems. You get an intellectual curiosity grade. And I'll share this really quickly. Dave, of course, you remember my 10-hour Game Changer admissions video series.
Absolutely.
That you bought and you went all the way through. That came out in 2014. Well, before I published that, I had an admission officer go through the whole series and say, I just want to give you feedback if you think I missed anything or didn't emphasize anything enough. And one of my former students actually was an admission officer, went through everything. She said, loved it. It was great, but I don't think you emphasized IC enough. And so IC, intellectual curiosity, is one of the most important things that colleges look for. It's that innate love of learning, that you're learning for the sake of learning, not just to get a grade. And so we'll be talking a lot more about IC in weeks to come. Take it away, Dave.
And just think, I must say, your last guest, Mark Kantrowitz, probably epitomized IC. Any guy who could love laddergrams, publish 10,000 articles, and have a penchant for Aboriginal Australian art probably ranks pretty high on the IC quotient to me. My wife was listening to that interview, and even she said, he's really fascinating. I'm glad you didn't ask the IQ question. It would really made us a lot of us feel real inferior.
Yeah, because I know he's got to be north of 170. He is up there.
I was like, that's one bad brother. All right, on to the article.
My thoughts exactly.
Let's turn to college hot topics in the news.
Coronavirus outbreak. This is an article by Emma Whitford, and it's highly topical. It talks about, are colleges insured against the coronavirus? And the short answer is not really. But what they pointed out, some colleges are. So what they said was some property insurance plans contain sublimits. And what that means is that they do have payouts for a specific type of loss for outbreaks and pandemics. But doesn't look like this would be very helpful, because in this type of policy, a typical $500 million property insurance plan would only include a $1 million pandemic damages sublimit, which doesn't sound that high to me. And it says that that policy would only cover buildings that were actually damaged or affected by the outbreak itself. And it said, quote, getting claims approved could be tricky because colleges must demonstrate actual physical damage to campus property to receive any compensation. And for such coverage to apply, an insured building must be contaminated and rendered temporarily or permanently unusable. So looking at this coronavirus, I mean, I don't think this applies whatsoever. Clearly, we don't know what this virus is, but it doesn't look like it's physically damaging property. And then there are other insurance plans that, like the University of Colorado has, where it's called, quote, business contingency insurance plans protecting against interruptions with contractors providing services such as dining and janitorial. And if a campus outbreak somehow interrupted covered contracts, colleges could file an insurance claim. And once again, this sounds like something that would be a very limited value. One spokesman for University of Colorado says, quote, insurances have limited this type of coverage, have expanded exclusions, and have drastically reduced limits and increased premiums, making these plans very expensive for colleges and universities. So the only other plan that it seems like could have been effective in this particular scenario was one that the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign sort of backed into because of another reason. 2 years ago, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign found that it had drastically reduced enrollment of Chinese students, resulting from this current administration's adverse policies regarding immigration and visas and so forth. In fact, it found that it had a tuition loss of 20-30%. And so it actually got a Lloyd's of London insurance plan that found that if it had an 18.5% loss in tuition, it would pay up to $60 million. In the case of the China student enrollment totally tanked and dropped to zero. And in this particular policy, it wasn't cheap. They pay $424,000 a year. But because right now with this coronavirus pandemic, a lot of the Chinese students and Asian students are not coming, they will probably be able to collect on this policy. But for other colleges thinking about simply going out and getting a policy of this type, The article points out that it's a little like trying to get life insurance when you've already been diagnosed with a bad disease, or fire insurance when your house is already on fire. So the bottom line is this coronavirus epidemic is probably going to have very dire short-term consequences for many colleges and universities. And considering, as we've already said in the past, that 25 to 30% of colleges are already on shaky financial footing, this could prove to be a step leading a lot of them into financial insolvency. The last thing the article pointed out was the impact of the coronavirus on study abroad programs. It found that 48% of the respondents in a particular survey had students that were planning to study abroad. But of these respondents, 94% had already either postponed or canceled these study abroad programs. So what say you, Mark?
Well, this is an important article because it's showing the connection between the coronavirus and the fiscal health of these schools. And everything is correlated. And let's start out by talking about China. I've said on the podcast before that China and India provide the most international students to U.S. colleges. But what I've never done is actually given a breakdown of the numbers. So I'm going to do this really quickly. I'll give you the 13 countries that send the most students to the U.S. Just going to round off to the nearest thousand. So you have Nepal at 13,000, Nigeria at 13,000, Mexico at 15,000, Brazil at 16,000. I'm starting from the 13th lowest and moving up. Japan with 18,000, Taiwan with 23,000, Vietnam with 24,000, Canada 26,000, Saudi Arabia 37,000. Now we're into the big three. So South Korea comes in third, 52,000. Number two, India, 202,000. And then the top country is China with 369,000 students. So this has already been a concern because that number, because of political tension with the current administration, those students have been going to Canada and Europe in increasing numbers, but it was more like 2, 4, 5, 6, 7%. Now you're looking at a significant decrease in Chinese students, and that's going to impact schools' bottom lines. What are you thinking, Dave?
Well, I was thinking that if you look at 359,000 Chinese students paying tuition at $50,000 a piece, you're looking at over
369.
Billion. Yes, 369. $18 billion plus hit to the economy. Just with the impact of Chinese students, you decrease that by a third. That's $6 billion. I mean, that's millions of dollars per university program.
Yeah, in some cases, almost more because sometimes they're in clusters and some schools inordinately rely on Chinese students for financial purposes. I know University of Indiana went from 68 Chinese students to over 2,000 in a 3 to 4 year period. And so, so this is just something to be aware of. And then, of course, other aspects are very interesting as well. So, Dave, this dovetails to what we talked about last week with online. So right now, even the U.S. students, now they're moving to online. Is there going to be pushback and blowback from families saying, hey, I'm not paying this amount of money for online. Like, I'll sit it out until this is fixed, or I'll do something else. I mean, you've shared something before, Dave. Talk to our listeners about how your daughter feels about if Yale's canceled for the rest of the year and she has to go to online. Why don't you share with our listeners what you've shared with me?
Well, it was funny because, of course, we were just so happy to have her home. She's our only daughter, and empty nest syndrome was sort of, come on home, and in the next 6 weeks, you can clean your room and finally get your driver's license. So I had things all planned. But for her, she looked at it as a loss of a real crucial part of her university experience. Her first couple months at university, she felt was a little tough because she didn't know anybody. She was still trying to get her bearings. She still hadn't enrolled in any clubs. But she said, Dad, I was just starting to get on a roll. She had become part of a play. They were going to have their production in the spring. She was part of a couple of social groups that had planned certain outings. And more importantly, she was finally starting to make friends and develop connections. And her sense was breaking it off just at this crucial inflection point almost is robbing her of the social and the networking benefits of college. And if she has to wait until next year, it's almost like she's resetting and starting over. So that was a real loss for her that I really had to understand. For me, I had already paid the last tuition check for the semester, and I'd reconciled myself to the fact that they weren't giving me back any of the money. So I was over it. But I think that's been a tough realization for her. And I think that is a real loss of the college experience. So for her sake, I hope it doesn't continue and is not prolonged.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to think about the big picture, like other people, like I'm probably more parsimonious than you, but, and I haven't had any correspondence from Georgia yet with Joy because they're on spring break. But if they cancel the rest of the semester and go to online, which so many colleges are doing, I know that I'll think, hey, I'm not getting my money's worth. I will have that reaction. I know I won't have any recourse. Not like I'm going to file an appeal and win, but I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels that way. If this thing ends up being pretty protracted, do people want to pay the same price they were paying? Because remember, you're paying for room and board there too. You're paying for room and board, which is anywhere from, it can be as much as $18,000 a year. And that's built into that price point. And now you're not getting room and board. So I don't think I'm alone in saying that people will feel like, hey, I'm not getting my money's worth here. And then you wonder what ramifications that has financially if this ends up being protracted and goes into another year kind of thing.
Well, not only that, my daughter brought out the point that she came home for spring break, but all her clothes and all her personal flex in her college dorm room is still at Yale. So we may be in a position of...
you go buy it again, buy more stuff.
Right. We may have to make a special trip just to pack up her stuff for the summer for a student who has actually not been on campus. So this could have some real effects. But I also want to dovetail back to what you said about online. And I was thinking that this could be a real inflection point for boosting online education as more kids get used to the concept of online. Because, of course, the options now is all these colleges are ramping up their online programs. So I'm going to ask you, what could the potential effect be if all these kids are forced to take their offerings online and maybe in 4 or 5 weeks find out, guess what? Online education is actually better than we thought. Is that going to really prove to be a boost for all these online programs that are already in existence and maybe even speed up the adoption of more traditional universities to online offerings?
Well, I definitely have had that thought. You know what it reminds me of, Dave? You like Tesla stock. I like Zoom because I use Zoom video for all my sessions with my clients.
That's right.
And so...
And wait, that stock is up like 25%.
Not 25, it's up 55, the last two, even through all this. And
55%.
Yeah, because people are now forced to work from home and then they're using Zoom. They're like, this is kind of really nice, And so I think it could have that same effect where and remember, this generation grew up looking at YouTube and grew up with a computer in front of them.
Right.
Very different than the boomers. And so I do think it absolutely has the potential to be an accelerant when it comes to exposing people to online education and convincing people of the value that online education or the role that it can play as a piece of their education. I'm sure, and I believe unequivocally, that the big purveyors of online education, they are, while not celebrating the death and the disease and the fiscal setback to people's retirement plans and every other consequence of this coronavirus, I'm sure that they are quite pleased at this opportunity they have to expose more and more people to the value of online education. So that is an interesting takeaway. Let's call it a day for this article because, we've had multiple people that have asked questions in the last month about the question of how can I know whether or not the colleges I'm considering are fiscally sound.
Right.
In fact, I think one person recently said, you guys keep talking about 25% of colleges are going to close. I'm freaking out. Which ones? Are they the ones I'm looking at? How can I know? So we're going to be taking that up in the next, it's either March or April for sure. And so we'll kind of resume this conversation again about how to know whether a school is, financially solvent or not, or what direction it's going. But for now, we just wanted to sort of show the link between Corona, finances, online education, and the changes that are happening in the country, and try to be relevant to what's on a lot of people's minds right now.
And if I can just add one other thing, it was brought to my attention that this coronavirus could be a sentinel event that changes the way we do things, not just this year, but actually for many years going forward. Because, folks, there's going to be more coronaviruses. Coronavirus is just a virus that's mutated or a new virus introduced to our system. But in a society where we have increased social mobility, where the ability of a person to go from China to America is just a 20-hour flight, we are going to have to be used to dealing with periodic pandemics, maybe on a much more frequent basis than ever before. So as we look at the changes that we're doing right now to address this coronavirus, I think those action plans are going to remain in place in the future to deal with the viruses and the issues of the future. So I think that what we learn now are lessons that we're going to take with us for many years to come.
Now it's time for our step-by-step walkthrough of the college admissions process.
Okay, Annita, Corona's dominating the news.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, how, if any, has it impacted your job or your life?
Well, Janaea is homebound. She cannot go back to school. And
for the whole year.
As of right now, the whole year. So, she is highly distraught, her and her peers.
I'm sure.
John just got canceled out for 2 weeks. We just battled it out at a grocery store a couple hours ago over some toilet paper. And I got a notice from work that I may have to work from home. Actually, I think they're making it optional now. But I told my boss last week, I was like, listen, I'm not going to trick you into believing that I work well from home, because I just don't. I just do not. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Life in North Carolina, coronavirus land. That's us.
I feel for Naya of all of those, because this is her senior year.
Right. Yeah.
I know how boarding school fosters this community, become sisters and brothers. And she's been there for 4 years. And so
she literally shot off all kinds of emails to the head of school, and they're they're strategizing on the language. Oh, it's intense. Yeah, it is.
So here's one thing for you to look into, and I don't know if they've talked about this, but schools like Harvard, Yale, and a lot of other more wealthy colleges are reimbursing people for a portion of the room and board.
Really? Ooh.
Yeah. Because that's part of what you pay for, right? It's that room and board. And you've paid that, and they don't have to spend the money on food. And I read a really good article on how this is kind of dividing the haves and the have-nots in college admissions. Mm-hmm. Because there's people that just we're just cash strapped. We don't have it. I'm sorry. We're not saying morally you don't have a right to have it, but it's just not in our budget. And then there's others that, it's the right thing to do. And quite honestly, we can't afford it.
Mark, I kind of sort of thought about that for a half a second. And then George School has been so awesome in so many different ways. I would not be surprised at all if they come up with that tomorrow. But I would not be disappointed if they didn't.
I hear you. That's a good way of looking at it.
They've been that. So it's been great. But to the chapter. Sorry.
Yes, that's
Mark
okay.
And I understand how we miss small talk.
Yeah. So I'm used to having my little small talk section with Annita at the start, and now I have it with Dave. And so it's just so weird to just dive on in. So we got to do small talk. All right. So we're in chapter 112 of 171 answers. We're looking at money. We're talking money from really chapters 93 up through 163, some aspect of money. And here we're looking at how do I get a merit scholarship from a public college. Nikki, you've read the chapter. What are your thoughts?
I did. So you are basically saying, let me just jump this one off with a question mark, because I read through the chapter actually a couple of times. And, of course, I read ahead for next week because we're talking about merit money from private colleges. So the way you frame this is that you said, check with your school counselor about state-based merit aid programs. So I was curious about that in itself. What is the difference? Why did you quantify this as a program as opposed to a scholarship, a merit scholarship?
Well, let's look at Georgia. So Georgia has the Hope Scholarship. Okay, that's a state-based program. It's run by the state. It's not run by the institution. And a lot of states have those. They have state-based programs.
Okay.
That are not initiated by the school. They're done at a much higher level. And so that's what I was referring to there. Does that make sense or not?
So are you saying that because Janaea's school is public, she got a merit scholarship? So are you saying that was a part that came from that merit program from the state?
No.
And not the school?
So there's multiple sources of merit money, right? One source is the institution itself, the college. Another is your state having a state-based merit program. And then, of course, there's outside scholarships, which is a completely different, genre or category. Civic organizations, churches, corporations, philanthropists, foundations. All of those can be sources of merit money. And so you just want to explore all of them.
Okay.
But when it comes to public schools, they may have a state-based program. Close to 20 states do, have it. Some states give all their money away on the basis of need. Some give all on the basis of merit. And a large number have both merit and need-based aid coming from the state itself, not from the school.
Okay.
And so it's just one source. Like when it comes to private, that's not an option, right? There's no state-based, because, private schools not thinking statewide. It's, it actually likes to have more people out of state. It's not prioritizing the state. But with public schools, you've been paying through your state-based, through your state withholding, you've been paying into the state coffers conceivably for a very long time if you lived in that state a long time. And so one of the places where you get that payback is through higher ed.
Okay.
So did I answer the question or not?
I think so, but let's keep going. And I feel like more is going to come after this. So a couple points that, I took away. The first one being that it's common for states to give away more merit aid to in-state students. So that was one. And then to get the merit aid, you would need to be in the top 5 to 10% of the applicant pool. And let's just clarify that. I'm assuming you're talking about grades and test scores. Are you talking about one and or the other? How is that determined when you say 5 to 10%?
Yeah, so let me actually add some nuance to both of those points.
Okay.
So, yes, typically it is much harder to get merit money from a college if you live outside of that state, if you're not in that state. For the reason I just mentioned. You've been paying into the state coffers all your life, and now's your payback. However, there are exceptions. There certainly are exceptions. There are out-of-state schools give merit money all the time. They tend to give it in smaller amounts. So it's usually not a case of do they do it or not do it. It's just, larger awards. And of course, keep in mind, you're already starting off with a lower sticker price. The difference between in-state and out-of-state is usually less than half. And, it's usually around the 40% mark. Some cases, it's about a third of what the out-of-state, student pays. So there's already substantial savings right off the get-go. And as far as the other point about the top 10 to 15%, or 5 to 10%,
5 to 10, yeah.
Yeah, that is for the largest award. So if you want to get the largest award, it's where you're normally going to need to be, in the top 5 to 10%. But what most schools do is they have tiers of awards, and they may have fancy names for like presidential or capstone or founders, or they may name them something, 1693 programming, something with their history that it's linked to, whatever they name it. They have all kinds of different names. But there's normally tiers of awards. And what I was saying, in order to get the largest awards, you're going to need to be toward the very top of your class. And yes, normally that is test scores and grade point average. Those are then curriculum to a certain extent. Because if, schools are looking at a weighted GPA, which some do, then, they're going to differentiate between a more advanced class and a regular class. Those are the main metrics that are used. It's not the only metrics that are used, but they're the main metrics that are used. Because what happens with merit scholarships is it's just like admission. We talked about admission. We've talked about admission by the numbers or formulaic admission, where you're crunching grades and scores and you're doing a grid oftentimes, or a freshman index, or we talked about the mandatory minimum model. We have to have certain scores and certain GPA. That's true for admissions, and it's also true for financial aid. So there are schools that strictly, give money away based on the numbers. And then there's schools that do it holistically. In general, once again, there are exceptions. With public schools, a higher percentage of them are doing their aid based off of the numbers. Doesn't mean there's some that are not holistic and comprehensive, because there are plenty going through my mind that are. And same on the private side. There's plenty that strictly do it off the numbers. But as a percentage, I find a higher percentage of public schools do their aid awards just off of the numbers. And when they do that, it's right on their website. They'll list it. They're not clandestine about it. You can go to the website and you can look up under, go to the admission tab and look under financial aid and scholarships, go into the scholarships tab. And if they explicitly tell you, you need this score and this GPA to get this amount of money, then that's how they're doing it.
Okay.
Annita and I are so grateful for everyone who has financially supported our podcast. It allows us to pay our staff and cover our other auxiliary expenses involved in having a weekly professional podcast.
At the start of every month, we're going to start sending a special gift to anyone who financially supports your college-bound kid.
I will be sending our donors this bonus content once a month directly to your email. The bonus content will be between 10 to 15 minutes in length. Usually it will be a college-related topic that I'm passionate about. Occasionally, it'll be another bonus hot topic in the news segment. Sometimes it'll be an answer to a question that one of our listeners submits to us via email.
And you'll receive these monthly audio blogs for a gift of any amount. We know that $5,000 to one person is $5 to someone else, and we don't want your budget to be a hindrance to you receiving this additional bonus content. So if you want to support our show, just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and click the donate button. And if you've already financially supported our podcast, you will automatically start receiving this bonus content via your email.
This bonus content is our way of letting our financial supporters know in a tangible way how much we appreciate you. And if you have any questions at all about our monthly bonus content, just send your questions our way. That's to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Once again, questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com.
Now, the next part of the chapter dives into flagship schools, where you start talking about flagship state schools. And correct me if I'm wrong, and this is what I think I took away from that, is that the flagship, meaning the larger public schools, don't give away so much merit aid because they got it like that. Like they know people are going to, clamor after them. So they're not pressed to give away so many merit awards. So if you are looking for a higher end merit award, you need to go to non-flagship state schools. Is that right?
Yes. Once again, there are some exceptions. Alabama gives away quite a bit. University of Kentucky gives away quite a bit. Oklahoma, there are exceptions. But first of all, let's start with helping people to understand what a flagship is. I think it's important to say more than just they're the larger ones. So You want to take that or you want me to take that?
You need to take that.
Okay. Well, I'm actually going to read a paragraph right from my book. So here's what I say. I say, every state has at least one and sometimes two flagship colleges. There's no official definition of a flagship college, but flagship colleges almost always have the following traits. Number one, they are large. Number two, they are prestigious. Number three, they offer a wide range of doctorate programs. 4, they participate in D1 sports. 5, they're older and more established. 6, they're the most expensive schools in the state as far as their cost of attendance. And 7, they are more selective than the other in-state schools, what we either call the master schools or the regional public schools. So that's basically what you're looking at when it comes to a flagship, what a flagship is. Mm-hmm. Now, and so a flagship's Ohio State, A flagship is the University of Georgia. The flagship is University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill or University of Virginia. So, and even that they may have satellite campuses, everybody, for the most part, gets that when you look at which is the biggest, the most expensive, the most prestigious, the biggest sports, the most PhD programs, that's your flagship. And the second point you brought up is important and it's valid, which is flagships don't give away in general, that much financial aid for out-of-state students. Now, why would that be true? You said they got it like that. So what does that mean?
Because they know that people are going to enroll, like people want to be there. So, it's more competitive to get in as opposed to not being in. Or did I say that?
Correct. Right? No. And this leads me to mention something that is extremely important. When I was doing admissions, this conversation came up all the time, which is money is an enrollment management tool. Do you know what I mean by that, Annita, or not?
Money is an enrollment management tool. It's like they use the money to either get the kid on the, I remember this from the chapter. So you talked about, and let me know if this is relevant to what you're saying now, is that they use these merit awards to either recruit the kid or they use it on the tail end to solidify, basically, to wrap up the deal for the kid that's been accepted. And they just want to make sure that they come.
Bingo. Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you see money through that context, the flagship school, like, when you think about your flagship schools, they're in demand. They're big time sports, gives them incredible name recognition. Okay. I'll just use one, Ohio State, right? Their big time sports gives them incredible name recognition, which elevates their prestige. They have all the programs that you could possibly want. And people will travel, people will go all across the country to come there to be a part of that, to go to a school that everybody's heard of, to go to a school with big time sports, to go to a school with every imaginable club and course and major you could ever ask for. That's valuable to people and they're willing to pay for it. So they don't have to do a lot of what we call tuition discounting in order to matriculate or to enroll students. Now, when some of the places where you'll find exceptions are, for example, some really small states like University of Delaware, University of Vermont, really small states that don't have huge, in-state population, you'll see those schools will oftentimes, come up with a lot of specialized programs for people out of state because they have so few residents living in the state to fund a big, huge operation like they'd want to. And there certainly are exceptions because what you've seen increasingly, the University of Alabama is probably the most notorious for this, is they've used that leverage of that big name to court out-of-state students and then give a minor scholarship, but you're still bringing in so much more revenue. So, for example, let's say your in-state tuition cost is $10,000 and your out-of-state tuition cost is $30,000. So this is a strategy that some flagships are doing, which is saying, you know what, we'll give $10,000 or $12,000 scholarship, but 30 minus 12 is 18. We're still getting 18,000 in revenue where we'd only get 10,000 if it was an in-state student. Does that make sense?
It does. No, it does. But let me throw this at you because one of Javon's family members, she texted me. She's out of state, and she said, "Listen, my son he's considering A&T, North Carolina A&T as well." And she told me that he got a letter from the department saying he got X amount of dollars for a merit scholarship award. She was like, "Wait, is that common? Like, is that all I get? Like, what does that mean?" So I told her to just reach out to the college itself and just ask them literally the question, and then to find out what other options there are. But what does that mean if they give them like like you say, a modest award, a merit award for an out-of-state student, but the tuition's still the tuition, out-of-state tuition especially, right? So what should be her course of action?
Well, you asked a lot of questions in there all in one.
Sorry.
First of all, the reason they would have given an award would have been this is a stronger student than the average. So you're using your money as an enrollment management tool to try to court some kids that you want. It's a small award because A&T is a state school. It gets state funding from the state of North Carolina. Its primary mission is to serve students in the state. Right. They're going to make sure that their money goes first and foremost to North Carolina residents. So that explains why it's small. And as far as what the course of action is, you can explore whether there's additional monies that are there. But a lot of times it is what it is. Like these awards have been established in advance. This is what we'll give to an out-of-state student that's got this type of profile. This is what we'll give to another one, this type of profile. And it is what it is. Like you'll have to make it work through other sources of money other than expecting them to say, for you to say, look, I need another 10 grand to come. Is there any way you can do it? That normally doesn't work.
Okay.
If that's what you're asking.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually a good example. And, right there, your own institution. And this is important because it's very common for somebody to want to go out of state to the big flagship school and to assume that they're going to give them a lot of money. I see this happen a lot with places like Michigan, UCLA, Cal Berkeley, Virginia. These are expensive schools. Like some of the costs, Colorado, some of the costs of some of these out-of-state flagships can be pushing $60,000 cost of attendance, and some are even more. But they have the cachet, to get it in the marketplace, and people will pay.
All right. And so before we wrap it up, Mark, how about that article you recommended, the out-of-state arms race, how public universities use merit aid to recruit non-resident students? Why are you telling us to read that article?
Well, because I think, it really goes into describing what I was alluding to earlier before. So let's take Alabama, for example, and I'm going to use them because they have the most what we call regionals. A regional is it's an admission counselor that lives in your local area and works the local market. So they don't go to Tuscaloosa, which is, where University of Alabama is headquartered, right? They have regionals, spread throughout the whole country, all over the country. You just work that market. So you can go to all the visits and the fairs and meet people at Starbucks and do all that. So Alabama is notorious for that. They have the most in the country. But this is part of a strategy to bring more revenue into the coffers of the school. And so a person can feel really courted by the school. Like, man, I met this person at the fair. They were so friendly. They gave me this. They gave me that. They said, well, it's full follow-up. I'm willing to meet your parents at Starbucks. And boy, that was such a warm greeting that I got. But this is part of a business strategy of using small little awards to recruit out-of-state students so that you can get more revenue in your coffers because they'll still pay significantly more than an in-state student would pay. And I just don't think a lot of times people know that game is being played. Because I'll talk to students all the time that will tell me how friendly this flagship school's out-of-state rep was when they met them, and they made me feel like this is where I want to go. But I don't always think people know the business strategy behind it. And that article, I recommend it. It elucidates that extremely well.
All right. So there it is. And next week, we're going to talk about the merit from the private.
There we go. There it is. Boom. You're bringing back some good memories of our first few podcasts. We used to do that. Oh, we're in year 3 now. It's like veteran status. So now we have some ancient memories.
And we do feel like we've been doing it for a minute.
It's time for a question from one of our listeners.
On to the question.
Yes. So what's our question today, Annita?
All right. This week's question is from, is it Annita, Mark? Because she spelled it? Or is it Annita?
So I have to tell you this. So, Annita reached out to me and with this question, and I'm actually working with her privately.
Okay.
And I said to her, please forgive me because my podcast partner is Anika. My wife's Anitra, and you're Annita.
All kinds of stuff.
I said all kind of names are going to come flying out of my mouth when I talk to you. I don't know if I'm going to call you Anitra or Anika, but just please show me some grace. And she took it so well.
Goodness. So Annita from New York. Yes. Thank you for your patience.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to read her email verbatim, I think. All right. It says, regarding our son's transcript, we have been told by his college counselor at the school that colleges take in consideration the rigor of the high school. And our son attends a selective school that accepts less than 10% of students. It is a college prep program, and he is taking the most demanding classes. My son and my husband wanted me to ask, would colleges look at a B+ from his school as equivalent to an A from a less rigorous school? I am inclined to say no, that colleges want to see all A's regardless, but would love to understand your experience with this.
So this is a really, really complex question. There's a lot of nuance to it. So I'm going to try to unpack it with all of its nuance. So I'll start with a couple anecdotes that I think I may have shared on this podcast before, but hey, if I have, most people haven't heard every episode. And if they did, I'm sure they don't remember everything.
All right.
But back in 2005, I invited Cliff Thornton to do a presentation at the big, international college fair that I started when I was at Westtown. Of course, we had Cliff on episode 30 on our podcast to talk about academic rigor and how that's used in the assessment by colleges. He's a 30-year veteran at Wesleyan in Connecticut. And so somebody from Germantown Friends, which is a very, very academically rigorous school, stood up at the symposium we had, and he was a keynote speaker. And they said, it's a lot harder to get an A at my school than it is at the school around the corner. So are you going to take that into consideration when you evaluate me compared to the public school around the corner? And Cliff's response was, to whom much is given, much is required. He said, I'm not denying that it's harder to get an A at your school, but you have every imaginable resource. The best teachers, to small classes, to incredible tutors, to counselors that, really understand the college game, that write incredible letters of recommendations, to opportunities to get involved in leadership because you're at a small school and you can shine and be that big fish in a small pool in all your extracurriculars. You have so many different advantages. So just understand that we expect a lot of you. That was 2005. Now, flashback to 2019, Gregory Roberts, Dean of Admission at University of Virginia, who's also been on our podcast. You can listen to his interview. It's interview number 33 on our website. And he was asked almost the same question at another symposium that I was at, this time at Westminster Schools in Atlanta, similar to Germantown Friends, arguably the most rigorous school in the city. And a parent stood up and said, it's a whole lot harder to get an A at my school than it is a school around the corner. So do you take that into consideration when you're evaluating applicants from our school? And I knew, I said, okay, here we go again, 14 years later, same question, same symposium. So Gregory took the question and he said, we take it into consideration, but not as much as you think we do. It's not like we're going to take your B plus and automatically convert it to an A. It doesn't work that way. So that's just background. So I know a lot of people may be thinking, well, it sounds like every school is just treated the same. An A is an A, a B is a B, no matter what school you're coming from. But that would not be true. That would not be true. It's true for some schools. There are, once again, I go back to this all the time, formulaic admissions by the numbers. Schools that use that are using a grid, that are crunching GPA and test scores, they are generally not making that differentiation. I had this conversation with Dillard. Dillard and Annita. Mm-hmm. They said a 3.8, because they require a 3.8 for the scholarship they have. It doesn't matter what school you're coming from. As they said to me, we don't have the staff and the ability to assess 40,000 schools out there and to see, is your grade point average, is it harder to get this grade point average from your X school A versus school B? So there are a lot of schools that will function that way. They'll say, we don't have the resources to figure out whether school A is harder than school B. So we group them all together and we just look at GPA and testing. That is common. However, you'll find that your wealthier schools, you tend to be your more selective schools, your schools that do holistic admissions, they can go to great lengths to try to figure out how one school is different from another. They can even go to great lengths to find out how one teacher grades differently from another teacher in the same school, and they do that. Well, let me ask you this. How do you think they do that? Schools that really try to figure out how school A is different from school B. How do you think they go about doing that?
Well, let's start with human resources. I mean, they have the manpower to be able to do that level of investigation, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So one of the ways in which they do it is by deploying those resources to visit and do an on-site visit at the school. Right? So they visit the school, they talk to the admissions, they talk to the college counselor, they do information sessions with students, they may do, interviews with students. They're doing basically an on-site visit and on-site assessment of that school to learn the differences between their schools.
But Mark, okay, so that sounds pretty, still, even with people with great resources, seems like a great extent of effort. So at what point does that happen? Does that happen because there's a school that they just gotta have, a student that they just really want, and they're sending those people out? Or is it that they're like you say, doing the group readings of these applications from this one school and they're just trying to assess it better? Like, when do they explore that level of research?
Well, that's all part of your fall travel. Mm-hmm. So you deploy your fall travel, and spring travel. There's fall travel and spring travel as a mission office.
Okay.
And first of all, you have all kinds of records. You can look into your database so you can see where you've gotten applications from. Mm-hmm. And so that's your job as a territory manager, to know your territory and to look in the database and see where, applications have come from.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so schools have a good handle on that. In fact, I mentioned this, a few weeks ago that when I sat in for a full day at Emory Admissions, there were schools outside of that region that they were getting 30 plus applications from every year. I mean, these are schools 1,000 miles away that they would get over 30 applications from. So that your territory, you know the different schools, and you know where applications are coming from. So you can just look at your historical data. Sometimes it may be, hey, you learn about a new school and you want to break in, so let me visit this. But typically you can just look at your past track record of applications and also even acceptances, and in some cases, even matriculants. You can study all of that. So that's one way. And some schools do that. If you look at Georgia Tech, they have it right on their website. It's called Admission Snapshots. You can look it up. It's in their institutional research section. And it will show you various schools, how many kids were admitted from those schools, what their incoming GPA was, what their test scores were, and what their first year Georgia Tech GPA is. So they have that's a school that has access to all of that. And when a reader reads a file, they can look at it and say, okay, you know what? Students that we admitted had a 4.11 GPA, and that converted to a 3.37 in our system. Now, most schools don't do that, but the point is some schools do. Some schools have that type of experiential rating from a high school, and they can apply it. Another thing that schools do is they study the school profile. They can study the school profile and discern very easily from the school profile what type of student comes here, what the curriculum distinctives are, and they can tell from that what type of student they're getting as well and how that student fits within the context of the school. They meet with counselors. So they have a lot of tools in their bag. And then it also depends on the philosophy of the school. So there are schools who feel like they would like to see more prep school kids coming, for various reasons. Maybe it's the level of rigor that they've been exposed to, or the level of diversity that they've had, or the fact that the recommendations indicate that they can trust what they're actually getting from this school. They can trust, who the school is sending because the recommendations are so detailed because they know the kids so well. And so there's some schools that really prize that more. And then there's other schools that feel like, you know what? We get so many kids from this more rigorous privileged community. And this could be true for a suburban public school or private. This isn't necessarily a private-public breakdown here. It's oftentimes more just a more well-resourced versus under-resourced breakdown.
Right.
Oftentimes.
Okay.
And so there's some schools that feel like we already have it in order. Now we've got kids out of the gazoo coming to us from schools like this, from this demographic. So it's, I've always said schools want what they don't have. So some schools just don't value it as much because they already have so many people coming from those backgrounds. So that's an individual thing that can vary from school to school, completely. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention here is that schools develop partnerships. So you can look at like a Milton Academy in the Boston area. They have a special relationship they've had historically with the Harvard, and University of Chicago. And you look at a school like Hotchkiss in Connecticut, they've had a special relationship with Yale historically. And so that can play a role. Westtown School, where I was at, a very unique relationship with Haverford. And so that can play a role. And in those instances, sometimes, a quarter to a half point letter grade adjustment may occur if you have those type of feeder relationships.
Are those relationships apparent? Or are they visible to the community that there's a working relationship between this university and this high school?
So you're really good at leading me right into what else I wanted to say. You know what? You are. Because
what I was going to say was, Mark.
Yeah, we have been. Not just the 3 years on the podcast, 11 years of working together. Right. So what I was going to say is the bottom line is it completely depends, right? From school to school, whether they do holistic or not holistic, whether or not they have a unique relationship with your school, whether or not they really value or are looking for more prep school kids or kids coming from affluent suburbs versus if they feel they're inundated. So all of those things vary. And then what I was going to say, which leads to an obvious question, how can I know as a parent whether it will make a difference, which is basically what you asked me, right? How can I know? And so there are a few things I'll say there. One, you can ask your counselor at your school, what's our relationship like with this particular school I'm interested in? What type of profile have you seen get admitted to the school I'm interested in? If your school is one of the 40% of the schools in the country that uses a resource like Navigator, you can go in there and you can look at the scatter plots and where it will show you from your school the type of kids that have been admitted to specific schools. And you can look at this intersection between test scores and GPA, and you can see like kids where I met, where they admit it, where they denied. The problem with that is there could be so many reasons why a kid with a certain GPA and test scores gets in or doesn't get into a school that does holistic admissions, because hooks play such a big role. Was it a recruited athlete? You don't know. Was it a development case? You don't know. Was it an alumni? Was it an underrepresented student of color? You know, and I could go on and on. Was it someone who's going to play the harp, you know, for the school? And so there's so many different reasons why a school will take a kid with a lower test score and a lower GPA, that I know schools that don't even share the scattergrams with their parents, because it makes everybody feel like they're all of a sudden an admission expert. They feel like they can just go in and look at the scatter plot and know, oh, look, my kid did better than that, so my kid's getting in. But you don't know that was a recruited athlete. So, but that is another tool in your bag, right? Asking the counselor, studying the Naviance distribution, looking at the school profile yourself, and asking admissions offers at the colleges. So you have some tools. None of them are going to give you probably the level of precision that you want, but you're never going to get that, because admissions is complex, especially at schools that do holistic admission. You don't know how your essays are going to read. You don't know how your extracurriculars are going to be interpreted. You don't know what institutional priorities the school has and whether you're meeting them.
So, Mark, you're telling Annita to start with the schools on her list and kind of start, exploring from there?
Yeah, well, and of course, I'm working with her, so I can, do some things and, work with her directly to help her with this process and help her understand these things. So let's take it outside of a context of someone I'm working with. So someone who's, working on their own to do this, and try to teach them that way. Those would be the things that I would say.
Okay.
That take a look at the schools you're interested in and then take them through that process and that I just mentioned, and see, and get a realistic assessment of whether or not you're a competitive applicant at that school.
Okay. All right, Annita, best wishes to you.
Yeah, and I'll try hard to get your name right. And Anika, I'll try hard to not call you Annita on our episodes either.
You better.
Oh, it's all good. Friends, hopefully you heard part 1 of my interview with Edan Shahar, founder of Test Innovators. In part 2, we do a little deeper dive, looking at a number of questions related to standardized testing. I think you'll find Edan's perspective to be refreshing as we grapple with some of the biggest issues and concerns and challenges related to standardized testing. Listen and enjoy.
And now, this week's interview with a special guest.
And so that was one of the points that I thought was interesting you made. It was the point that the test is the culprit. It gets all the blame. But in reality, it's the barriers to it's the fact that these places are hard to get in. And if it wasn't the test, it would be something else. And another point, another point that you made that I thought was really good was, while you certainly would be the first to say that there's clear-cut advantages to coming from a highly educated background as a parent and having wealth and resources and how that correlates to the test. But you also brought out something I'd like you to talk about this, which is other aspects by which colleges evaluate applicants also benefit people with privilege. So if you could comment on that was another point.
Well, I think that what's going on at the UC schools, and for those that don't know, there's some lawsuits that are going on. I think the city of Compton and a couple of other cities are suing the UC schools right now and claiming that the fact that they're taking the SAT and ACT tests, and the fact that students that are minority students and are doing significantly worse on those tests demonstrates the fact that they're using a tool that is inherently racist, and that there's a problem with that. One of the challenges with this is if you go and you look at the alternative, one of the alternative things that they're talking about is using the Common Core test that California uses. The rates there are the exact same. Students that are, I think I had it pulled up and I sent it over to you, the rates of students that are meeting or exceeding expectations, again, it falls very similar to race and a couple of other factors like that. And I think that the fundamental point is just that, the racism goes so much deeper than just this one test at the end of your high school, right? If you have been it goes hand in hand with poverty and with income and the rest of it. If you're a student that has had tutors along the way, and some of the other ways to look at it is they're looking at GPA, or they're looking at state standards, or other or extracurriculars. All of those things are going to be highly, highly correlated with your ability, to get the tutors to send you to some foreign country to do your service project so you can write a story about that, to send you to your athletic things, to buy you equipment. All of those things, again, any way you're going to cut it up, if schools are asking the questions on these other aspects, again, there's going to be this high correlation with income. And as we know, there's a high correlation in this country between income and race.
Yeah, income, race, and parent education, all three. And I think it's even more fundamental than that, because I think one thing people sometimes don't realize is that first and foremost, your main teachers are your parents.
Mm-hmm.
So when you grow up with highly educated parents, right from the time you come out of the womb, there's educational advantages, from the language that's spoken, to the travel, to whose peer group you're introduced to the ability to move into really good school districts, even if they're free and they're the best suburban public school districts, to hiring the best tutors, as you mentioned, to getting your child into extracurricular sports, which cost a lot of money, which then give your child an athletic hook or a music hook. To demonstrating interest because you can attend a school summer program, or you can visit campus, and there's $10,000 plus or whatever of airfare involved in traveling. So that's one of the things which no doubt is a valid point. Like any other metric schools are talking about using in place of the test still connote the same idea, where there's privilege, and it's highly correlated to privilege, education. And oftentimes those things also correlate it with race. So those are all, I think, valid points.
Yeah, that's right. So long as there's this barrier, so long as there's a finite number of slots at these institutions that, again, have perceived value, and there's some measure by which they are deciding between one student or the other, people will do whatever they can in order to get their kids in. That's just what's going to happen. There's just no way of getting around that. And so today it's a test. I think that there was an Atlantic article about this a few years ago. If it was, a shuffleboard, if it was your success as a shuffleboarder on a sailboat or something silly and ridiculous like that, people would train for that as well, right? And they would have their kids get on sailboats every weekend and play shuffleboard, because if that was the entrance requirement for schools that was, arbitrary and silly, then that's what people would spend their time and money on. So, I guess that is kind of the reality that the world, so we sort of live in many levels of reality. There's sort of the holistic, political landscape, and then there's the actualized, manifested, what happens day to day, and actual students that are going through it every single day. So what we believe as a company is, what are the tools that we can create to level that playing field? And the great thing about technology is that you can, because the cost is low to create something and, to deliver it, it's online, we're able to make the very best tools available to every single student. And we think that's sort of the beginning of how we solve some of these problems. But obviously a lot of it is very large social issues.
Yeah. And I want to get into that in a second on cost and what you guys do.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, I use a lot of web resources when I'm researching colleges. One of my absolute go-to websites is the National Center of Educational Statistics College Navigator website. The College Navigator is a government resource, and it has voluminous amounts of information and institutional data on programs that are offered for each college and by each college. There's insightful information on retention rates and graduation rates, cost of attendance, prices, aid, need-based and merit-based aid available, degrees awarded, campus safety information, student loan default information, accreditation information, and so much more. You also have a great comparison tool where you can compare up to 4 colleges. It's a website. I use it, and I use it all the time. I can't recommend it highly enough. It is the recommended resource for episode 112, College Navigator. We will now return to my interview with Edan Shahar. I do want to, I don't know if I've actually told you sort of when the nuance kind of my thought on the test optional movement. It's very, very complex question. You know, I think that, and I tell people there's no doubt if you're looking at two students and they both have 4.0s and one student is a 35 or a 36 ACT and another student is a 20 or a 10 or 1,000, that's a different kid, you know, in terms of their ability to handle higher level work.
Yeah.
And do reasoning and even read and comprehend more complex tests. There's no question about that. And I understand, especially the most rigorous schools in the country, how they would like to have that tool in their bag to aid in the assessment, especially with the grade inflation that's out here. However, I'm very respectful of the test optional movement. You know, there is a lot of research that shows there are enough tools in the bag for a school. It's more work for them. You know, they have to really get to know each individual school and how they grade and what their courses entail and study grade trends and maybe interview more and maybe ask more call specific questions. But you've got schools like Bowdoin with a 50-year track record of being test optional and having graduation rates for their test non-submitters that are the same as their test submitters. And an argument can also be made that, and I think is a kind of a powerful one, that there's a prejudicial nature when that numbers play in the mind that causes tests to have an undue influence, and the average admission officer is unable to put the test in its proper context without giving it more weight or influence than it should have. The same for rankings. There's something about the mind. If mind sees a number 3 versus a number 130, and I'm sitting here and telling somebody, no, that 130 really may be the better match for you. You know, they look at me like I came from Mars.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on this? So I really come down on the fact that I'm very respectful of the test optional movement. Quite honestly, I celebrate when a new school goes test optional, but I'm also not critical when I talk to an MIT and they say we have done significant research, or Harvey Mudd, and how the tests correlate with our program is we just can't ignore that research. You know, it's very significant. So I'm respectful of that, but I'm also celebrative when people learn how to do admissions without the tests. And there are just so many people that have done that and done that well. U Chicago, another example, gone recently. I've met with them 2 times since they went test optional. And they said, Mark, it's working extremely well. We're able to admit kids without that and get the right kids. And so Wake Forest, I met with them after they went test optional in 2008. Same thing. Graduation rate for non-test submitters versus test submitters, same thing. GPA is the same. So it's more work that it creates, but it can be done. So that's a mouthful. I just kind of wonder, any comments at all on anything I said there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the core concept there is that tests in and of themselves are not sort of useful, right? The underlying sort of the first principle approach of what is the question that you're seeking to ask is where the whole thing should be started. And it's also, I think it's relevant and important to realize that standardized tests in the way that they are constructed today were really sort of invented in the 19-teens and came into, more usage in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, right? So these are fairly old instruments, and there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of change and a lot of exciting things, I think, coming down the pipe. And it's fundamentally the question you're seeking to ask is a student going to come to my institution and be successful? I think that's one important question. And then are they also going to be part of the right student body mix that I, as the college and the admissions department, am looking at? So again, I'm not a college admission or a college or represent one, so I don't know exactly how they ask those questions. But I think that you're getting to some really interesting stuff that I think that there's coming down the pipe some really fascinating things. And they go, it's a bigger thing than just the SAT and ACT, right? Because if you think about tests, it's also, we use tests to get into law school and medical school, but then we also use, and many other schools and postgraduate schools, we also use tests to figure out if you should be a lawyer, right? There's the bar exam.
Right.
The boards, right? So it is sort of this ongoing, and whatever is Series 7, whatever.
And really everything, yeah. You know what I mean? Well, it's the NCLEX, whether it's nursing.
That's right.
It's the DAT if it's dental school. It's the LSAT if it's law. It's the bar, the bar exam, obviously CPA, Series 7.
That's right.
So they are part of the culture.
They are part of the culture. They are part of society. And I think that the question that really needs to be asked are we coming to a place where there are better methods and tools for measuring students? And that, I think there's a lot of people trying out really cool stuff, right? There's more practical things. And, we're also seeing it, we're beginning to see it sort of in our own platform. We think that the measure of how students prepare, sort of how some of those other measures. Today, we just do it because we found that there's a high correlation between student growth and these other measures. But, we have our grit score in our platform, which of course, it's a nice educational buzzword. But for us, really what it means is like, when does a student give up when they are confronted by a question they don't know, or do they double down and improve? And so again, we think that there are a lot of really, really interesting questions to ask. And I think specifically about, the admissions department and how they look at these questions. I don't know too much about it, but I think it's great. And I think that the less barriers you have, the more students you can bring in. But I would just say, you could also effectively operate as test optional if that was actually important to you. I mean, if you're Harvard or Stanford, you could just admit students that have, and I think that they do, admit students that have incredible other talents and skills that maybe their test scores are significantly lower. So, I guess it goes back to what is the story and experience you're trying to create for students that are applying to your institution. And certainly I think that depending on the type of school you are, it can make a lot of sense that you would say, we fundamentally don't like having this type of number. I don't know if they also, you're talking about the salience of numbers and them sticking in your mind. I don't know if they also ask for, not GPA optional schools, but maybe we'll get there as well.
Yeah, I think, that's difficult because where grade point average is your productivity. Like that's a 4-year track record of what you've done every day for 4 years. Did you get up? Did you submit your work? Were you consistent? And that's just been proven over and over and over to be a better predictor of GPA.
Right.
And so I think part of the test prep movement, is trying to underscore one transcript, but also it allows aspects of character to come more into the forefront of the evaluation. And that's one reason I'm supportive of it, because I do believe there is such a high correlation between character and campus impact and life impact.
Right.
And so it just allows other factors of who you actually are as a person. And, I never told you this, Edan. You may be familiar with this, but Tufts, Choate, and Yale have been part of this study now that's like almost 15 years old.
Yeah.
Where they've been looking at emotional intelligence and how it correlates with success. And some of the research that they're producing is incredible. And,
right.
I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that because I usually present at the annual conference that I know you regularly go to. And I've attended many of the sessions, even like the smaller group sessions with like 6 of us around the table talking about the latest research. And I always had the same point to them, which is, I think what you're doing is amazing, but because numbers are so prejudicial, if you can turn this into a number that goes into the file, that's when it will have impact. But when someone's looking at a number and someone's talking about this squishy character traits, because of the prejudicial nature of numbers, the number just overpowers. And, I can't tell you how much when I was in admissions, when we would talk amongst each other, people oftentimes would be seen through the prism of their number. This is the kid that got the blah, blah score. And so that's the thing that concerns me. And until the emotional intelligence movement can translate something into a number that goes into the file, its impact is blunted. So I'm a huge advocate of all of that emotional intelligence and wearing those factors, but it's got to be translated into number before it's going to have impact.
Well, and I think that it's one of those, truisms of business. I don't know if it's Peter Drucker or one of those guys that talks about what you measure grows fundamentally.
Correct.
And if you want to have, in business in general, if you want to have a process that you're improving, and I think everyone kind of knows this at this point, you really need to begin to measure it. And today, that's just a hard problem to sort of measure these emotional aspects in any sort of way. And then I think we also then maybe lose some of the value of them if we are just giving them a number. So it's a deep, fundamental, and important issue. And one that I totally agree with. I'm an employer today, and certainly intelligence is an important question, but I don't think it's the most important question when I'm thinking about who to hire. I think it's I'm looking at, first of all, is this somebody we can work with? Because that's just like a non-starter. Right. If it's somebody that we cannot operate, we cannot have sort of the EQ, the emotional intelligence to work with us, that's a problem.
Yes.
And then from there, the other thing that I'm actually most interested in is how quickly you can learn. It's not just what you know. It's, have you been taught to learn? And are you, when you're confronted by questions and problems that you've not seen before, can you collaborate and work on them and improve quickly and actually, deliver meaningful results? And that's really what I'm seeking. And I think what most employers, and I think, again, just for any I think there's also value in education beyond just the employability of students coming out the other side. I think that's what's necessary in society and for successful human life. And I think that until we have better tools for measuring that, we are going to continue to sort of go for what is measurable, because that is a number you can hang your hat on. I mean, if you look at, and, I know there's anger around Bill Gates and, his help with charter schools and whatever else it is. But, at the end of the day, if you're looking, the measurement tools that he uses and others use is going to be these test scores. And so is this really what we ought to be optimizing for? I think it's certainly an open question, and one that we think about a lot here as well, because we've even found that if we can create sort of certain undercurrents and feedback mechanisms that go beyond just, your score on the test, but actually measure and give you feedback on the process of improvement, we see that there's more improvement, which is ultimately the goal anyways.
Yeah. And, I was really happy that you went with the whole theme of what you look for when you hire, because I often use that example when it comes to building a class. The hiring example, I say, no employer, who's about to hire a team, and that's kind of what you're doing with admissions, is you're building a community.
Right.
Nobody would say, oh, well, just, the most important thing to me was your test score. Right. Like so many factors beyond that determine who's going to be a good fit. It can be skill set. Skill set can be important, but it's unlikely that you're going to measure that by a test score. You're going to use other metrics to measure skill set. And certainly, like you said, can you work together? And then your ability to learn, and, many, many other things we could talk about as well. So I was really happy to see you go there, because to me, that's really, the analogy that I use when it comes to admitting a class is, now obviously you're admitting a class into an academic institution. So there does have to be some bare minimum in, levels of excellence. And if you're striving for excellence in your school, there needs to be some demonstrated areas of proficiency. So the example doesn't work perfectly, but it works pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think that I'm really interested to see how folks are thinking about, these other aspects of curiosity and collaboration. And like you said, the challenge, of course, is that it doesn't sit as a number that you can compare every single student on. And then again, we get into other problems, as I mentioned, when you're trying to turn everything into a number.
Well, yeah. And I know how hard that is, at KIPP, where, I work, is my 11th year here.
Right.
And we have been talking since I got here about moving away from compensation based on seniority to performance-based compensation. But you know what? It's just it's so difficult to come up with metrics that work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, for example, probably the most impactful teacher at the school I used to be at, he would have been fired if the metric was surveys, because he was so hard that parents didn't like him and students didn't like him. But then when they came back from college, they raved about how well he prepared them.
Right.
So if you can use test scores as one part of your metric, but if you're trying to use surveys and feedback, well, there's limitations with that. So so it sounds a lot easier than it is. So come up with, convert all these emotional intelligence to a number and then use that. It's a lot harder to come up with a system that people agree is fair. It's a lot harder. But one thing I would say that would transform college admissions overnight would be if there was a score that measured these EQ factors, these emotional intelligence factors. And then if U.S. News and World Report embraced it and put it into their formula for rankings, it would transform this overnight. Because right now, that's already the tail that's wagging the dog out here. And it's a whole other subject. But that would transform this whole process instantly. But obviously,
I would say my hypothesis, though, is that, within 3 months, we would have the same exact situation. Because what would happen is, maybe college rankings would move up and down. But you would say, like, first of all, how do you measure it? Okay, we're going to start optimizing for this, right? Oh, it's like the number of community service hours you do. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Right. I've got, we're sending our kid to whatever, to go volunteer for the whole summer. And another kid has to have a job to, help support the family. And like, you're very, very quickly, anytime you're comparing two human beings on some sort of metric like this, it's not just an innate ability. It's sort of how well, their environment can help foster them doing this thing towards their objective.
Next week in the news, Mark and I will be discussing legacy admissions and our article is by Ron Daniels from The Atlantic entitled, Why We Ended Legacy Admissions at Johns Hopkins University. Mark and Annita will be discussing part 2 of how you can find merit-based scholarships from the colleges themselves. Mark and Annita will also discuss our question, which comes from Dan in Maryland. And Dan wants to know, what are my son's options if he accidentally submitted the wrong personal statement? Mark will be in his final part of his interview with Edan Shahar, the founder of Test Innovators, and they will be discussing what is misunderstood about standardized testing. And finally, Mark will be going to Rhode Island for the second time to do a college spotlight, as he and I will be discussing Brown University.
Friends, I am very excited about Christopher Newport University. It is an example of a school that most people have not heard of, but it is a gem, a diamond in the rough. And I particularly wanted to talk about it because it proves the point that just because you haven't heard of a school, it doesn't mean it's not a good school. Shout out to Sasha Keurig, one of the real pros in the business. She's an admissions officer that handles a lot of out-of-state applications. And I got to spend a lot of time, well over an hour, just with Sasha, learning about Christopher Newport. So Christopher Newport's a school that is in Virginia, and it's in the Tidewater section of Virginia. I know that area well because my youngest daughter, Joy, was heavily recruited by Virginia Wesleyan. So you think about places like Norfolk, Newport News, Chesapeake, not that far from Williamsburg, and really not that far from Washington, D.C. as well, or Richmond. You're looking at 3 airports within an hour of that area. Norfolk is a huge art and science center. A little bit more about Christopher Newport. So it's a place that celebrates students that come in undeclared because it is a liberal arts and science institution. In fact, over 50% of students come in undeclared with their major, and they love that because they want to expose you to all of their different disciplines. And then in the sophomore, you can figure out what you want to do. Now, I've talked a lot about mission statements and how important they are, but I haven't talked a lot about mottos. And mottos can teach you a lot about a school. So the motto for Christopher Newport reflects their values. And the motto is simply this: lead a life of significance. Lead a life of significance. And all of the programs are kind of put through that filter. Not how does my education benefit me, but how can I be a difference maker in the world? So leading a life of significance. It's a very friendly school, a very welcoming community, a place where people open the door for you. It's a Common App school. They do ask for a personal statement as well. And they only have college-specific essays for their 2 special programs, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. It's a public liberal arts college, similar to UNC Asheville, which we talked about as the public liberal arts and science school for North Carolina. We mentioned there's 29 of these schools around the country. It's a school that has right on the cusp of 5,000 undergrads and 100 grad students. Now, it's a newer school, unlike Brown, where we're talking about next week, one of the oldest schools in the country. Christopher Newport is only 60 years old. And it has a fascinating history. And I think the one thing that really got me excited about this school, Dave, is to see the transition that's happened with the current president, who's in his 24th year, who's just completely transformed the school. So this is the interesting history of this school. So 60 years ago, it was originally part of William and Mary. It's only 20 minutes from William and Mary. And originally, it was designed to be the 2-year school that fed into William and Mary. So go to Christopher Newport for 2 years and then transition and go into William and Mary. So they were that way for the first 10 years of their history. Then they had a complete change, and they decided that they were going to be a 4-year school that wouldn't necessarily be a feeder into William and Mary, but they would be a commuter school. So, not much dorm life, not much residential life, more of an adult and older population, but take courses in the area. Then a new president came in who made a serious commitment almost 25 years ago now and said, no, we are going to be a residential college and we are going to become a national university. And so I just love to see schools that have successfully gone through transition like they have. So they literally went from being a commuter school to now 85% of students live on campus, and freshmen, sophomores, and juniors are all required to live on campus. So that's a complete change of school, Dave, to go from a commuter school to one where 9 out of 10 almost are on campus, and first, second, and third year students are required to be on campus.
That's an impressive transition. My question is, where'd they get the money for that? Fundraising. And as you prove your value, you can charge more tuition. Now, I know from just my meetings with Sasha that originally it was challenging in the Newport News, Norfolk area because people had seen them as this commuter school. So where they actually had tremendous success was by going to Northern Virginia and Richmond and into Maryland. And there they sort of got a chance to tell their story fresh and come in with that first impression and not have to sort of fight through the stigma of being a commuter school. Because I've seen other schools that have tried to pull that off, that transition, and they haven't always been successful because they just had a reputation as being a commuter school for, some non-traditional students. And it's just hard to become a residential student school, a national school, and to really try to target, 18 and 19-year-olds. But they've done it very effectively. They're actually the third most selective public school in Virginia. So University of Virginia and William & Mary would be the two most selective schools in Virginia. There are a lot of schools in Virginia that I will profile at some point that are very good, that I've spent a lot of time at. Schools like George Mason, Mary Washington, James Madison, excellent schools in Virginia. Christopher Newport is actually more academically selective than any of those. So, but they can still take a range of students. So 3.5 weighted is their average GPA. They read an application holistically, though. And typically, if a student has an 1100 on an SAT, 22 ACT, and a 3.0, if the other pieces of the application look good, including your grade trends, and I say the other pieces of the application, they are a school that encourages, they don't require recommendations, but they love to see them. And the majority of students submit them, so they are usually getting multiple recommendations. And one thing that excites me is you don't normally see a public school be so holistic, Dave, but the majority of their students have interviews. And I can't think of another public school in the country where the majority of students have interviews. And not only that, they're not interviews with an alumni or with a senior fellow. A lot of schools have programs with senior fellows who are like senior students who oftentimes have been school ambassadors or tour guides, been kind of in the admission process for like maybe 2 or 3 years, and then they sort of take on that role. No, their admission officers do the interviews. So they're putting their manpower, their salaried employees, and they're doing these interviews, which is really impressive to me that they're being that holistic in terms of really, because their view is that you're so much more than a GPA and a test score. We're going to get to know you and all aspects of you to see if you're a good match. And they're kind of smart because if you want to be considered for their merit scholarships, then interviews, they make it very clear that it's absolutely in your best interest to have an interview, which also incentivizes people. Now, of course, some of them are in person, but nowadays, most of them, of course, are going to be through like Zoom or Skype, which is fine. They put a huge focus on your senior year grades in the admission process. That's a really big thing. And they put a huge focus on extracurriculars. And they do look at demonstrated interest. They make it very clear they're a school that likes to see a student build a rapport with the admission officer. They like the email communication. They like to kind of get to know you so they can assess whether or not you are going to be a match. They are working on expanding. There's an opportunity for you listeners outside of Virginia because right now they're a public school for Virginia. So like most public schools, majority of the students are from Virginia. In fact, 90% come from Virginia. But the places that have really been growing recently have been the Mid-Atlantic, like New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Georgia, Florida. They're really making inroads into those places. And it is a real part of their institutional priorities to grow their out-of-state population. And so they're on the lookout for out-of-state students right now. 1/3 of the curriculum that you have are in your major. 1/3 are electives and 1/3 are distribution requirements. They do require foreign language to graduate. They have both early action and early decision. Strongly recommend that you at least apply early action by the December 1st deadline. Anyone who interviews, as I mentioned, is considered for an automatic academic merit scholarship, which can help offset their costs. Their costs are about $45,000 out of state, much less in state.
I'm going to normally give you the out-of-state numbers for a public school because most of you will not be living in the state that we're talking about. So $45,000 is their cost of attendance out of state. Students can get another $5,000 to $7,000 off merit scholarships if they interview. And students are also encouraged to answer a short extra question to be considered for scholarships. And once again, those scholarships are automatic. So 65% of their students will actually interview to be considered for those scholarships.
And Mark, that's $45,000 all in, everything included?
Correct. So I'm so glad you said that, Dave. That's all in. When I give, in fact, let me just take the time to say this. When I give cost of attendance. And that is going to be tuition, room, board, student fees, transportation, books and supplies, personal miscellaneous spending money, everything from the movie you go to, the pizza you go to, concert you go to, books, transportation, all in, every penny. So yeah, that's very different because sometimes people think it's just tuition. So I'm glad you pointed that out, Dave. It's a good catch. Another thing that I love that they do is some very, very unique things that they have within their curriculum. For one, they have an honors program that I love. What happens in an honors program is courses are tied to a topic and it's interdisciplinary. So for example, if you take, let's say your honors program is World War II, you're not just going to study the history of World War II. You're going to study how all the economics of all the countries were impacted by World War II. You're going to talk about how people marketed the war. You're going to study the propaganda that was used at the time in the war. So you're not siloed into one mindset. So their honors programs are interdisciplinary and they're taught by different faculty in different divisions. They also have another program. These are their two sort of like scholarship key programs they have. One is their honors program and another is called PLP. And I love this program. It stands for Presidential Leadership Program. They put a huge focus on leadership at Christopher Newport. This is actually their most popular special program, their PLP program, and it deals with leadership development. So you're taking courses on leadership, you're studying leadership, you actually get a minor degree in leadership, you study theories of leadership, you study history of leadership, you study how to be a good follower, you go to a speaker series that they have on leaders. They bring in some of the key movers and shakers around the country that you meet with seminar style in their speaker series. And then there's a servant component as well that's built in. And they help you find a leadership program that you are involved in for all 4 years. So I just think that's a fantastic program that they offer to develop and cultivate the leadership ability of the students. I'm just going to stop for a second, Dave, and just see what your first impressions are so far.
Well, this is one university I haven't visited, and so I was not familiar with before your profile, but I'm always impressed about institutions and colleges that realize that the pathway to success is to grow and to think big. And the fact that they were able to transform themselves from what essentially seemed to be almost like a community college feeder school to a national university, I think is quite impressive. As you were talking, I actually pulled up pictures of its campus, and it seems very beautiful. I am familiar with the Norfolk area. You know, Mark, I work in that area. I gather it's just down the street from Hampton University. Is that correct, or fairly close?
Correct. So listeners, Dave, as you know, is an emergency medical doctor, and he's licensed in 12 states. And so he really gets to get around to different parts of the country being a doc, and then he'll drive around and check out campuses. And I remember when you were there not that long ago, you're like, this part of the country is nice.
It really was.
That was like within a year. It was not that long ago you did a stint in that part of Virginia, Dave.
They really do. It's very pretty. In fact, they have an area. It's like a conservation area. They call it a swamp. They call it the Great Dismal, but it's actually quite a very beautiful area. And I remember driving from Suffolk and then through Norfolk, and then I took a stint up to Richmond to see University of Richmond. So I am familiar with this area, and it's a very beautiful area. So it seems like a wonderful place to go.
Yeah. Now, their racial diversity is not where they want it to be, and that is also a top institutional priority for them, is increasing racial diversity and geographic diversity. They're currently 75.5% Caucasian, 6.5% Black, 5.7% Latinx, 5.5% multiracial, 3.1% Asian, with a very small international population. Their business school is probably known as maybe they're one of the strongest programs for sure. incredible advising, and they really focus on networking and helping you find a job through their advising system, not just at their senior year, but throughout all 4 years. Some of their other really strong programs are biology and environmental biology. This is an area where they offer a master's program here. And of course, leadership studies, of course, is a strong focus. Pre-med and pre-dental are strong. And like most schools in Virginia, political science is very strong. History. In fact, Dave, this is where, you know how when you haven't heard of something, but then once you hear it, you start to hear it later?
Yes.
So that's because you're into politics so much. Yeah. One of the things they're known for is the Christopher Newport political polling that they do, which many regard as...
That's right.
So now it comes back to you. I knew it. Yes. Yeah. So they really specialize in, particularly for Virginia.
Yeah.
And some people would say they have the best polling for polling the state of Virginia. So you'll probably be hearing a lot of as we get closer to election. According to Christopher Newport polling, these are the polls. So that brought back some memories when I said that, Dave.
For all you 538.com junkies, you know who you are. Yes, I can.
And that would be you speaking to yourself, correct. My friend.
That's right.
Some other really good programs they have are their Lawson Center for Music and Theater, Computer Science, Computer Engineering, and Electrical Engineering and Physics. Now, one of the reasons why these programs are so strong is they're located right by a major national physics lab, the NASA Lalene lab, and they're only 5 miles away from the Jefferson lab. And so what that does is it just gives them incredible talent because of the people that work there end up being faculty members. It's also one of their few graduate programs that they have. Remember, this is a school with 5,000 undergrads and 100 grads. And so this is one of their strong grad programs, is their program in computer engineering, science, electrical engineering, and physics. And one of the things that's great is the people that are in that program, they make sure that they get paid internships while they're going through college. One of the areas they're really focusing on growing right now is graphic design. It's a newer program, but they're putting a lot of resources in to grow it. And they've just rolled out a new national security minor to focus on national security to go along with their cybersecurity. Like I said, they draw heavily from the Richmond area, from the northern DC area, but they're close to a military base in the area. So there are quite a few students actually that have been in Virginia through the military base. So they might have lived in Colorado or California or some other place. So while they are 90% Virginia, it doesn't necessarily feel that way because they do have a lot of students with the military background that are there. There's a huge focus on travel within the school and study abroad. And that's an overview of Christopher Newport University. Any final comments, Dave?
Well, once again, a great addition, to our list of universities. I'm looking at reviewing the profile. So you said that kids with good, solid B+ scores, good, solid ACTs, you have an opportunity to get into a nationally ranked university at a reasonable price point. $45,000 all in is very reasonable. And you also happen to be in a region of the country close to DC, close to Richmond, very nice climate. It sounds like a very, very solid addition to anybody's list of universities.
Well, yeah, they're also really courting out-of-state students. So that $5,000 to $7,000 automatic academic scholarship, you're going to have to be above their average student, but you don't need to be like 1,500, 399 to get that. It can be an additional $5,000 to $7,000. One thing I love about the school is how well they go, the extent to which they go to really get to know their applicants before they admit them. I mean, any school that's doing an interview, that's encouraging multiple recommendations, multiple essays, studying all your extracurriculars, want you communicating with the admissions officer throughout the year. They're investing a lot of time in trying to have a certain kind of community and to get to know you as a person. And that portends well for the amount of personal and individual attention that you can receive when you're there. So I just think they're a school on the move and they're doing a lot of really good things. And as Dave said, it's a fantastic part of the country to be in. And I think what it reinforces is that you have these schools out here that have niches in certain areas, like leadership. I mean, they've got unbelievable programs, as well as some of the other things I said earlier. Remember, Dave, when we talked about Oklahoma, we talked about how strong their programs were for things like petroleum engineering or the National Weather Service or Native American studies and some things. So, you get these schools that are extremely strong in a particular area. And that's something that I think families need to think about, not just overall rankings, but how strong are they in my area of study?
And I think that you're spotlighting the fact that they have highlighted their political influence through becoming a very well-known and respected polling organization is very interesting. It reminds me of Quinnipiac University here in Connecticut. Same thing.
You know, it's funny you say that, Dave, because when I talked to Sasha, she said we are similar to Quinnipiac. That would be a northern school that would be similar to us.
Right.
Asheville would be a similar school in North Carolina in terms of the size, the interdisciplinary education, the focus on internships, the price point, and the experiential education. So
that's right.
Awesome.
That's right. And the internships is cool as well. I mean, you talked a bit about the co-op programs. It's not quite a co-op program, but anytime that you can supplement your college education through on-the-job experience that you're getting paid for is a huge plus as well.
Well, hopefully what people are realizing is there are great schools out there for the B and B plus student. You know, you can listen to the media and think that if you're not 4.0 and 34, 5, 36 ACT, 1500 SAT, like, you know, your options are severely limited. And that's just a bunch of malarkey. That's just a bunch of twaddle. And so one of the things we're trying to do is highlight some of these schools that love a good BP plus student and will give you a great education. They keep their classes very small at Christopher Newport as well. This is a place where you know your professors, you know, as well. Next week, we'll be giving you all the way the other spectrum because there are kids that would just thrive at a place like Brown. So we're not going to exclude some of those schools, but we are trying to have more schools that an average to slightly above average student could go to than just the ones that are only taking the 1%.
Wonderful. Awesome.
So, Dave, I know you said, don't you go to, speaking about Asheville, don't you head to Asheville pretty soon?
I am heading to Asheville tomorrow. So it was very interesting. It was my daughter's spring break, and I got a call up from one of the hospitals and said they wanted to know if I was interested in giving them a couple days in Murphy, North Carolina, which is about an hour and a half from Nashville. So I thought, hey, Laura and Frida, come join me. I'll do a couple shifts, and then we can go down to the rest of North Carolina and go to the Biltmore and hang out. But they've been paying too much attention to the news, and they told us that's okay, too much coronavirus. We are going to stay here and binge watch Netflix. So I am going to be all by my lonesome in Asheville for 4 days. But that's okay.
Yeah, I know at one point you were talking about flying into Atlanta and we're doing a steak dinner, but it just didn't work out. But good for you.
Yeah,
I'm waiting with bated breath, Dave, because I'm so excited about my Boston trip from the 5th to the 8th of April to tour 5 colleges. And all the correspondence from them is saying, as of now, we haven't canceled for Corona, but keep checking your email. So hopefully I'll be able to take that trip and give everybody updates on the 5 colleges I'm visiting there.
Well, if you are a consistent traveler like we are, the amazing thing is that you'll never get better hotel prices. And if you do want to go on a cruise, you'll probably have the whole ship to yourself. So that's another thing to consider.
Hey, Doc, don't tell anybody to go on a cruise. I mean, listen, I'm not afraid to fly right now. I'm really not, but I would not be doing a cruise. That's one thing I would not be doing. I mean, boy, when that community spread right there is a little scary. I've actually never done one, believe it or not. I'm not a crowd person. I tend not to like crowds. But
I'm not into cruises. I mean, everybody comes in having eaten way too many carbs, 20 pounds overweight. So it's okay.
All right, Dave. Have a good week, my friend.
You too, my friend.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. Your College Bound Kid is produced by Dave Visaya of podcastengineers.com. If you find this podcast helpful, it would help us tremendously if you would subscribe and write us a review on your favorite podcast listening station. And please be sure to click the share button and send this to someone you know that can really use this information. The amazing music that you hear is by Victor Allen Weeks. Our image editor is Tauha Khan. Webmaster is Stallianos Dimitru. And marketing designs are by Kimberly Blass. And if you want to get a copy of the book, 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions, you can go right to 171answers.com. And if you want to have a college coaching session with Mark, you can send him a text to area code 404-664-4340. And if you have a question or a few questions that you would like to ask us, and we'll include them on the show, you can just email us at questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Every week, we'll take one question and include it in the episode. We don't like your questions. We love your questions. So send them our way. And by the way, check out our website, yourcollegeboundkid.com. Again, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to meeting with you again next week.